Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar on first-time fund managers in emerging markets, bringing a new model to private equity in Africa. My name is Nicole Harmon. I'm a program associate with the Intentional Endowments Network, and I'm very pleased to have with me a great group of panelists to share their experience and expertise on this subject today. Next slide, please. We'll be hearing from Brian Mesway, founder of Bnew Ventures, Dmitry Fotiyev, managing director of Brightmore Capital, Roeland Donckers, co-founder of Yungo Capital, and Brendan Mullen, managing director of Secha Capital. After a presentation from each of our panelists, we will spend the remainder of the hour in dialogue amongst the group in responding to your questions. So please enter your questions throughout the presentation in the chat function of the control panel at any time, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. This webinar is being recorded. It will be distributed to all registrants by email and will also be available on our website shortly after it's completed. So you can refer back to this conversation and share it with others, and we will also make the slides available upon request. Next slide, please. So just briefly before we dive in, for those of you that aren't familiar with the Intentional Endowments Network, we are a nonprofit collaborative peer learning network with the goal of supporting endowments in enhancing performance by aligning investments with institutional mission, values, and sustainability goals. We do this in a variety of ways, including hosting in-person forums and events, facilitating peer networking, curating useful resources on sustainable investing opportunities, and providing educational venues such as webinars like this one. So we encourage you to stay engaged in these conversations after today's webinar. More information is available on the website. You can see a link on this slide, or you're welcome to reach out to us at any time. So with that, we can go to our next slide, and I'll turn it over to our first presenter. Brian?
Thanks so much, Nicole, and really glad to be part of this webinar. And welcome to everyone who's on board. Really happy to have you guys here. So I'll spend a couple of minutes talking about what we do at Bnew Ventures, and look forward to a rich discussion after all of us have talked through our different companies. So just a bit about Bnew Ventures. So this is a company that was born out of some research that I did after business school with a professor of mine called Clay Christensen, who has written books around disruptive innovation, and really thinking about how we can start from being behind and very quickly kind of get to the fore. Originally from the perspective of companies, but increasingly, and in my work with him, increasingly looking at it from the perspective of economies. So we focused really on what needs to be done at the company level to get countries, especially in Africa and Asia and South America, to climb the disruptive ladder and really rapidly grow and create jobs for their citizens. So we founded Bnew out of that belief. Our vision is really to build companies that will create thousands and tens of thousands of jobs, and really in doing that to accelerate economic development across Africa. Bnew means our home, and really there is a second part to the vision, which is around creating a new narrative and a new story for Africa, and having African companies led by Africans to be at the fore and to be inspirations for the citizens of the continent. So if we move to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more around how we do what we do at Bnew. So hopefully that slide has come up. But if I just kind of speak at a high level, there's a couple of things at Bnew that we think makes us unique and different from your classic fund. I think the first of them is that we focus, very, very exclusively on a very small set of companies, typically 1 to 2 companies at any given time. And within that, what we aim to do is really to have companies that have in some way or form the potential for rapid development and rapid scale. And the way that we judge that is really by looking at other contexts. So very specifically, looking, for example, at what's happened in Asia, in China, or in Latin America, and finding examples where by targeting the low end of the market, and by the low end, we specifically mean companies that or markets where people have not been able to get high quality services at scale in an affordable way. And we look for examples where that's been done successfully, and we try and replicate that in markets where it hasn't been done. So we find individuals who have experience in a particular domain or sector, and we combine that experience with some experience on how to grow companies at scale. And what we call these companies is market creating disruptors. And the reason for that is that they create new markets, and they do this in a very disruptive way with a disruptive business model. And in doing that, they create new value chains and really mass access for non-consumers. So that's our vision, to create as many of these companies as possible. And the tools that we've set up are really just around identifying the right individuals to do that with, and also being the right partners to push forward on that. There's a broader team of us that are working on this, but really at the core of it is myself and a co-founder who I met at business school, who was also a co-founder with me on a previous company that we launched called Wave Academies, which is a vocational education platform for West Africa. So Wave is actually one of our partners when it comes to scaling businesses that we've invested into. Our aim is to really, as I mentioned earlier, to not only be investors, but to be mind changers. So if you look at the impact ladder in the middle of that slide, we really just start off with potential, and the aim is that we create not a massive set of companies, but even one company that can change the narrative. We think can be powerful in drawing the right kind of money and the right kind of resources into Africa. So we're really aiming big. What we would love to create in 10 years is individual companies that we've supported over a long period of time that have really changed the system and changed the way that things happen. Our approach towards doing that is structured across four kind of key different categories. The identify category, where we really shortlist SMEs based on growth potential, specifically around understanding where it's been done before and if it has been done before and what drove that success. But also around the quality of the management and the quality of the individuals that are running those companies. We invest normally a pretty small amount in the grand scheme of things, in the range of 100 to 500K. But then we often crowd in investments once we get the company to a level that we call the scale-up level. A quick tidbit: sometimes we invest what we call royalty capital, which means that we then earn the money back through a percentage of revenue. And that helps to de-risk the investment for our investors, and also actually provides liquidity for companies who would not normally get debt in the markets that they operate in. And then we scale companies with very heavy support. Both myself and my co-founder worked for many years in the management consulting world, so we have access to resources from there and experience too. And then ultimately we bring on other funders once the company has gotten to scale-up level, which hopefully generally happens within a couple of years. There's a couple of companies that we're working with right now, but most of our attention is on the first company within this pipeline at the bottom of the slide, which we call Life Stores. This is a chain of pharmacies that was modeled after a chain in Mexico that got to around 4,000 pharmacies in the space of 10 years. And really has been a revelation in how it's helped to transform access to high quality, affordable drugs for ordinary people. And we're hoping to do the same thing in Nigeria. And we have just launched the first of the pharmacy chain, and we're bringing on board some investors actually to help to grow at a rapid scale. And then we also work in certain markets very specifically with especially in Ethiopia. We've had conversations and soft partnerships with a couple of partners to help us to identify the right kind of SMEs. So pause there and then just step back and just reiterate why we're doing this. Which is that ultimately, we think that the story of Africa being disruptive in the future needs to be driven by companies, and that really having just a couple of companies that change the narrative is more than enough to create what we would term system change. So to really change how people think about Africa, both as investors and as operators. And we hope that by doing our part in funding and growing these companies, we can help to light the fire that pushes others. So I shall pass on to the next presenter. So I think we'll talk about Brightmore Capital. And do you want to take over from here, Dmitry?
Thank you, Brian. My name is Dmitry Fotiyev, managing partner at Brightmore Capital. We invest in and empower a new generation of West African entrepreneurs, and our mission is to generate attractive returns for investors while promoting the economic and social development of our region. Our region is specifically Francophone West Africa, as you can see on the slide. And not only do we have a current local presence, but our entire founding team has lived, worked, and invested in our region, as well as doing investments together for the past 2.5 years. As we build SMEs into what we call regional champions, and I'll focus on that in one of the subsequent slides, we focus on Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire as the two key and the two largest economies, while also allocating part of our investments to the rest of the countries in the region. And we invest in what's called a sweet spot for SMEs, companies that are able to absorb an aggregate of up to less than 5 million euros. Companies that can then scale up and achieve significant economic and social impact. Next slide, please. I think the slide is still changing. Can everyone see the next slide, or is it still at the same original one? Okay, yeah, I think the well, let me go ahead and start, and I think the slides will catch up as we go along. We are a very diverse team that's composed both of natives from the region as well as expats. And what's unique about our team is that unlike a number of West African funds that have been started by former bankers, we actually have a very operational background. Every single one of us has operated and started businesses in Francophone West Africa, so we know firsthand what it's like to be an entrepreneur, and therefore we can be much more effective in helping and partnering with entrepreneurs, helping scale their businesses up. Additionally, our backgrounds involve a range of industries involving management consulting, private equity, and international development. So together with our staff of interns and analysts, we're actually very well positioned, not just to make good investment decisions, but to really have hands-on involvement with our portfolio companies to take them to the next level. Next slide, please. And in terms of the opportunity that exists in Francophone West Africa, we are a region of over 140 million consumers, a unified legal system, and also a unified currency, which for us as investors is conveniently pegged to the euro, eliminating FX risks. And as you can see on the slide, we're working with some of the fastest growing economies on the world. I mean, let me pause and repeat that. We are working with some of the fastest growing economies on this planet. These economies are rapidly urbanizing, growing. They have very young populations, improved stability over the last 10 years, and all of these factors create an environment where there is a lot of new SMEs that have started and that are starting. However, there exists a big growth gap for these SMEs. And this gap manifests itself primarily in the lack of financing. The banks require collateral, which a fast-growing business just does not have. And traditionally, there's been a low PE and VC presence in the region, meaning that for a business that wants to scale, that wants to grow, there's really a complete scarcity of financing options available. Last but not least, in addition to the lack of financing, businesses also face scaling challenges. Next slide, please. And as a business grows, it needs a different set of competencies, a different set of skills to take it from the next level. I should highlight here that while we do not invest in startups, we target specifically what we say mid-range SMEs, in the sense that these are businesses that have been operating for at least 2 years, who already have revenue, who already have customers. These businesses, as you can see on the slide, are basically in the small business stage. And we have a program called Brightmore Champions that takes these businesses and takes them to the next level by systematizing the business processes, instituting proper governance, professional management, and really creating a well-run enterprise that can scale, that's less dependent on the entrepreneur, and that can become what we call a regional champion, serving multiple markets, whether these are local markets in Francophone West Africa or becoming a successful international exporter. And by doing such, we basically enable businesses to be able to later accept later stage investments, whether it's via debt financing, finally making these companies that were previously not bankable, making them bankable, as well as allowing them to become eligible to become investments of a large number of larger funds. And this is another thing that we've seen in the region, is that there's a number of regional and Pan-African funds that target businesses above 5 million euros, but not many that go below that. And this position, first of all, it's very catalytic to the economic development of the region, but it's also very advantageous for us as investors, because this large number of funds bigger than us actually provides a good number of exit opportunities. Next slide. In terms of the industries that we look at, we are a multi-sector fund. So once the slide advances, you'll see some of the key sectors that we target, which are the food value chain, financial inclusion, renewables and clean tech, as well as essential services such as healthcare and education. We also specifically look for innovative business models and disruptive technologies that are applicable to really all of the above sectors. So what we've seen in West Africa is that there's a smaller number of pure technology businesses, for example, but some really exciting opportunities that we're looking at right now. For example, applying new technologies to the food value chain, or applying new technologies to education. And we see a lot of opportunities both for growth and for achieving impact within this space. And as we please transition to the next slide, let me talk a little bit about our impact thesis. Traditionally, impact funds have been sort of stereotyped to be not interesting economically, meaning that, as an industry with impact investments, we're always trying to fight the stereotype of being equated to philanthropy. And while impact investments do generate, much of the same benefits that philanthropic investments do, we have a very key difference, is that especially with the new generation of impact funds, we are return first. Meaning that as we consider an investment, primarily we want to make sure that the investment is interesting from an economic perspective and an investment perspective. It has to generate at least 25% or more of IRR to become investable by us. At the same time, we also use impact generation as a key investment criteria, and we deliver impact by, first of all, being an economic developer and a job creator for SMEs, and besides jobs, also providing key services to the population affected. We are a financial catalyst, not just investing ourselves, but allowing business to become eligible for other sources of financing. And last but not least, we serve as a foundation of an ecosystem, an entrepreneurial ecosystem that has been much more developed in the Anglophone countries in Africa, certainly South Africa, countries like Ethiopia and Kenya, but has been largely absent in the Francophone part of the continent. And by being one of the first funds targeting high growth opportunities in this region, we actually serve to create this kind of an entrepreneurship ecosystem for SMEs in the region. And with this said, I thank you all for listening, and let me transfer the presentation to Roeland from Yungo Capital.
Thank you, Dmitry. Hello, everybody. My name is Roeland, and I'm managing partner of Yungo Capital. Yungo Capital was set up last year as the first open-ended impact investment company that exclusively provides finance and support to early stage and early growth SMEs in the East African missing middle. Next slide, please. So to better explain this, I think there's no better way than with an example of one of our investee companies. This is Sharon Sabiti, and her business produces high quality stone veneer for residential and decorative purposes. She started the business in 2010 in her own backyard, but since the end of 2015, she also started exporting regionally, first to Rwanda and then lately into Kenya. Now, banks won't finance her business because she doesn't have the traditional collateral they expect. But we still thought the business was interesting. They were showing good revenue, good profit margins over the past couple of years. It's a company that employs 30 people, and only fulfilling their order books at the time we were looking into it, which was second half last year, was going to double their revenue, increasing the team with another 15 people and creating additional employment and income for people upstream their value chain. But to do so, they needed a working capital investment of $125,000. Now, like Sharon's business, there are literally thousands of businesses in East Africa. They're perceived too small for other investors. Many of them are agricultural processing companies, light manufacturing companies that have the potential to create both social impact and good financial returns. But reality is that they're stuck in what is called the missing middle finance gap. With a financing need between 100,000 to 500,000, they are on the one hand either too big for microfinance, on the other hand too small for banks and most other impact investors. So for us, and that was the main reason we started with Yungo Capital, the challenge was to find a cost-effective way to provide both finance and support to these smaller businesses. Next slide, please. So we came up with a couple of solutions. And to tell you a bit more about the first solution, I'd still like to introduce you to someone else. This is Iga. Iga is an entrepreneur. He's also from Uganda, just as Sharon. He has made investments before. He also leads an organization of local angel investors. So he's well connected. He's in a place he can give back, both by investing and sharing his network and expertise. Iga, at the time we met, was looking for new investment opportunities, but he didn't want to make the investment alone. So because of his background in construction, we invited Iga to co-invest with us under the same terms into Sharon's business. And by involving him in this whole investment process, we were able to reduce, to save on certain costs in line with the percentage that he was co-investing, which is a minority of the total capital. And that might be small, but it's still substantial for us and helps us to continue doing these smaller tickets investments. And as we provide majority of capital, we are also in a way de-risking the co-investment of the business angels. So finding interest in business angels to co-invest with us has actually been quite easy so far. So on top of our impact goals of generating jobs, generating income, and financial inclusion, providing finance to businesses stuck in the missing middle, we also like to think that we are developing that local angel capital market. Next slide, please. Now, apart from the business angels, our second solution is how we provide support to our investees beyond the mentoring of the business angels. Another reason many of these businesses are stuck in that missing middle finance gap is that they're often simply not ready for investment. So next to Yungo Capital, our solution was to set up a separate entity called Yungo Excel that prepares our potentially future investees for investment. It has a separate team, a separate business model, and the business model is based on success fees. So pre-investment, that TA work is basically about rebuilding the financials, the accounting, adjusting the investment plan, refining strategy, mapping out what operations might look like once we transfer the money, doing an ESG baseline. Post-investment, we continue working on finance and accounting, governance, strategy, marketing, HR, and only for business-specific technical matters, we work together with external partners. Next slide, please. Then finally, the third piece of our puzzle was about how to structure both ourselves and our investments. So we decided not to create a closed-end limited partnership, but an open-ended holding company, because we believe that in a way is better adjusted to the reality of these smaller companies, avoiding having to do an exit because the fund at a certain time would be closing. We also think that there's a certain fatigue in the investor community with management fees, carry structures, that holding companies like ours don't have. Then on the deployment side, we also decided not to invest equity into our companies. On the one hand, these smaller companies, most often family businesses, shy away from giving up ownership. And on the other hand, it's difficult to realize an exit, again, for these smaller companies. So we invest through self-liquidating structures, either straight debt, mezzanine debt, or a combination of both. Sorry. This also makes that we can offer a faster turnaround of our investors' capital, offering downside protection while giving access to a potential upside. We typically do 2 rounds of financing, and after that, we expect our companies to be ready for the more traditional funders and other impact investors in the market. Next slide, please. Then our team. So as mentioned, Yungo Capital was founded in 2016 by Stephen and myself. And today we're a team of 4 people. I think combined we have over 40 years of investment experience in emerging markets, of which almost 25 in East Africa. We have combined, again, hands-on experience building startups, scaling up growth stage businesses, even doing turnarounds of non-performing businesses and providing the necessary technical assistance. Together, we believe we cover the necessary skills that are required to adequately support and invest in smaller SMEs that are still part of this missing middle. I think that's it for us. Thank you for listening, and I'd like to hand it over to Brendan Mullen of Satcha Capital. Thank you.
Hi, this is Brendan Mullen. I lost Roeland there at the end. Not sure you can hear me, but I will soldier on. First of all, I just want to say it's an honor to be among this panel. Thank you very much for the inclusion. I do promise you that next one of these there will be a female on there, and I would add that Satcha Capital, despite the 2 co-founders that you see at the bottom, we do have a majority female group. So coming in at the end, I thought I would tailor my talk a little bit to kind of a summary, and I certainly heard some common themes. I think it's worth highlighting them now because I think it's right. So I think Brian kicked it off with talking about the narrative of systemic change in Africa. At Secha, we talk about the stocks and flows, changing the stocks and flows of both growth capital and human capital. Everyone spoke about the operations, the boots on the ground, often very programmatic, but with context. And then a lot of people talked about investing in established SMEs. And I think all these, are shared to some degree, and all fall under the sustainable development goals, and all are impact and financial return focused. And so I think that's a good segue to talk specifically about Satcha Capital, because we share a lot of these ideals. And I think everybody would agree with me that there's opportunity out there, both for impact and for financial return. And we all have a little bit slightly different bells and whistle, but we all know it's about execution, right? So in Satcha Capital, we're based in South Africa. We're going south during this, and we invest in established FMCGs and agribusinesses. So like many of the above, we provide patient capital for established SMEs in the missing middle. Importantly, we address the management gap by actually joining the team. I'll go into that more later, but one of the MDs is the lead, and we have an extern from Bain or McKinsey that we second, and they serve as chief of staff for 6 to 9 months. So out of respect for what people said before, I'll skip the what and the why, but just to underscore that, jobs are crucial on this continent. Jobs often come from SMEs. In fact, South Africa, it's a huge driver of economic growth. But the problem is not just the missing middle, which I think a lot of you probably hear about, but also the management gap, right? So companies have gone 0 to 1. Now they want to go 1 to 10. How do they do that? Well, it usually means requiring cheap capital, but it's also very difficult to attract, develop, or pay for outside talent, and that's where Secha comes in. So as you may be able to tell from my accent, I think I'm the lone American on this panel, but I've been here in South Africa for 4.5 years, originally with Bain & Company. My co-founder Rachel Balab, who is South African, we designed Secha, and you could view it in a way as an accelerated search fund, or an opportunity to invest in an established company in an almost boring market, a fragmented market. So we don't take tech risk. We don't take product market fit risk. We invest in established FMCGs and agribusinesses, and then we use a boots on the ground model that has both a ground and air attack. Consequently, meaning oftentimes we invest in fewer companies, but the companies that we do invest in, we scale for depth, not for breadth. Now I can go into that in the next slide and speak a little bit about how Satcha Capital is different from your standard LP-GP relationship and kind of classic 2 and 20 private equity fund, and why we feel this model works best for our environment. So if you look at the slide in front of you, we have the standard fund support value chain, and then we want to kind of dig in on how we focus on the missing middle, as well as the management gap. The first row is how it's usually done, which I'll go into. The second row is what makes Secha unique, and then the third row is an example for our first investment company called Native Child, which is a natural hair care product for the ethnic women. So running quickly across the first row, usually it's investing in kind of big ticket sizes. You get classic PE funds take the 2 and 20, which is fine. It just doesn't work for us. It's usually one-time capital infusion, and obviously not. This doesn't apply to the previous funds, but it's more of an advisory role. You help hire outside talent. So I think that works in the U.S. and in Europe, but I don't think it works here. So Secha, to kind of underscore that we invest in these ignored, fragmented, but profitable sectors, right? Again, kind of using that search fund analogy. We get cheap valuations, to be quite frank, and we get very small but impactful checks. And then, of course, there is this robust SME pipeline, especially here in South Africa, where there is this kind of bifurcated market of traditional trade and modern trade, which I can get into later. In terms of fund, there is reinvestment capability, but importantly, we can also earn equity via sweat equity, which we've now done with our first 2 investments. And then lastly, in support, much as we discussed before, we're very much operators. We have a very codified, but tailored to each company accelerator toolkit that we complement with our skills transfer playbook. And this is often driven, boots on the ground today, by our extern. So this is Bain, McKinsey. We have a rotational program with them. They serve as chiefs of staff to these SMEs, providing leverage for the founder and helping focus on strategic things, but also, honestly, taping boxes here and there, or doing a sales pitch, whatever needs to get done. So let's walk through that in terms of Native Child, our first operating company. So natural hair care for ethnic women is a niche growth vertical, and the number one impact metric for Secha Capital is to create jobs, but every opco needs to have a story as well. And natural hair care for primarily in this country for Black women is very empowering. It saves money, it saves time. I could go on, but I also think that's importantly for bullet point number 2. That's why it's a customer journey that is very much misunderstood by these multinationals. All right, so we identified the vertical, invested in Native Child, wrote a fairly small check. So in this case, it was $100,000. We usually go up to about $500,000. but it was crucial for a few new hires and trade spend getting into retail. And I would also add, in terms of kind of thinking in terms of the needs of the company and also financial returns down the line, there's a 2-to-1 sweat equity to growth equity ratio, meaning we earn 2 times more equity in terms of our human capital than in our growth capital. And then very tangibly, what does that mean? Well, we have that air and ground game. We have channel access to some of the biggest retailers, pharmacies, salons here, based on the kind of the experience that Rachel and I had at Bain and in our own kind of network. And then, of course, the Bain extern is there day in, day out, setting up CRM, pushing through orders, making sure supplies are coming in. And some of these quick wins has resulted in we have a pro bono Facebook partnership. We have kind of an optimized now fulfillment, i.e., it's kind of tech enabled as opposed to just writing addresses on box and sending out, and then a proper CRM. And I think now we can go on to the next slide, where I can kind of end it. I certainly would not want to speak for the others, but at Secha, what we often say is that we're builders, not flippers, right? Patient capital, we're operators, not financiers, and we've certainly heard that theme throughout. And usually one of the first questions I get is what does Secha mean? Well, it's my wife's language. It's Songa, and Secha means search, which the idea being that the next great African company is already out there. It just needs a little bit of help. And with that, I think we go into the Q&A period, and I believe that Nicole will be leading this. Cheers.
Great. Thank you so much, Brendan, and thank you to all of our panelists. As Brendan said, we're going to go to the next slide. And for our panelists, if you could go ahead and take yourselves off mute, we'll jump into our questions here. And for the audience, please do continue to type your questions into the chat box in the control panel, and we will get to as many as we can. So I wanted to start with a question for all of you. Do you consider your firm's work to be impact investing? And if so, could you talk a bit about how you measure that impact and if you see a trade-off between impact and financial returns?
Well, this is Dmitry Fotiyev with Brightmore Capital. Let me go ahead and start on this. We do not see a large trade-off between impact and returns. And this is one of the advantages of working both in fast-growing economies, but also economies where you have very substantial economic and social development needs. We see many opportunities where impact goes hand in hand with the core activities of the business. So for example, we've made an investment into a mango processor that sources mangoes from smallholder farmers that would otherwise go to waste and turns them into an exportable product. It's a very high margin business, but at the same time, it's a business that by the very virtue of its operations, it's also generating tremendous impact in the agriculture value chain. And it's just one of examples where the activities of a business is very well integrated with the impact it generates. So we see the two going as hand in hand.
Hi,
just go ahead.
Okay, this is Roeland, Yungo Capital. I agree with that statement. For us at Yungo, there's not a trade-off either, because of the type of businesses that we want to work with, which are the smaller ones that find it hard to find the necessary support and financing. And the role that they play within the economic system, I think 75% of the businesses, both our pipeline and portfolio, are somewhat linked to agriculture or agricultural processing, light manufacturing within an East African context, employ about 80% of the population. So any investment in a business that helps them to grow creates indirectly jobs and income opportunities upstream. On the return side, I mean, wanting to help to grow these businesses doesn't affect the return side. Maybe more specific for us, again, on the type of companies that we work with, we're not into, as I tried to explain before, either private equity nor nor venture capital. We don't expect to that these smaller companies are capable of growing 10, 20 times. But with the growth that we foresee of 4 or 5 times is still a very interesting return, even on a net return to our investors. So no, there's no trade-off between social and economic impact.
And just to add to that as well, this is Brian Mazer from Bnew Ventures. I think that I would agree with both Dmitry and Roeland that I think depending on the industries that you work on, you can kind of manage away that trade-off, right? I think all of us are working on SMEs that are job creating, that are working in the real economy, and often actually are very labor intensive in the type of work that they do. I think in environments like that, you can kind of align the stars a bit more and create impact and value at the same time, versus, for example, working in oil and gas or more extractive industries. I think for us at Bnew, we are quite aware though of there is the trade-off at the macro level, which we just talked about, but there are also trade-offs at the micro level within an investment. So is there too much of a rush for us to exit an investment? Or do we have the patience to really build the systems that will last going forward? And also, how are we, really treating our employees? I think that there are perhaps some micro considerations to take care of on a company-by-company basis, and it always varies by company, to make sure that when we say impact, we are kind of layering that down all the way down to every single person that is associated to the company.
Yeah, I might just add one more component to this. This is Brendan Mullen of Satcha Capital, and one of our main theses here is that in South Africa, at least, if we can invest in these SMEs, there's actually a lot of white space between the SMEs and the multinationals that currently have a lot of market share. And if we focus on these niche growth verticals, these fragmented sectors, again, as I mentioned, then we can play into that kind of mature market where there's actually a huge precedent and analogs of strategic investments and additional private equity. So it's kind of a nice way to take advantage of this unique dichotomy that we have in our financial markets here. Cheers.
Great, that's very helpful. And Roeland, you just mentioned the huge role of agriculture, and in Dmitry's presentation, he talked about the different focus sectors Brightmore Capital targets in their fund. So Dmitry, could you talk more about why you target those specific sectors? And then Brian, Roeland, and Brendan, could you offer any thoughts on that as well?
Sure. So let me kind of go sector by sector. Food value chain and agriculture is really, first of all, one of the largest economic sectors in West Africa, and really much like the rest of Africa. It's also one of the sectors where the region, just due to its geographic placement and climate, has a large economic advantage. We also really like food value chain because of its impact generating potential. There's certainly the very obvious ways that impact is generated via jobs and via providing greater food security. But at the same time, we also see a lot of value chain impact both upstream and downstream. So I'll give you another example of a company that is in our pipeline. It's basically an organic fertilizer producer that addresses a key problem of nutrient scarcity in the regional soils. And by basically selling this product to farmers, they can increase the yields of their crops. We see tremendous impact potential with such investments as that. Financial inclusion is also a very important sector, just because much of the population is still not banked, and we see a large trend of certainly of mobile money and technology at large being a very disruptive force in the market and providing access to financial services to people who would otherwise not be able to be bankable. Renewables and clean tech, I think that one is just very straightforward. I think this is where progress is going, and certainly, again, due to the geographic placement of West Africa with plenty of sun as well as wind and water resources, it's just a very kind of an obvious sector to invest in, as well as also as the economies are growing, certainly the consumption needs for energy are increasing. So there is a very big impetus to make sure that this need is being filled by clean energy rather than fossil fuels. And then essential services, again, there is a tremendous need for healthcare and education in Francophone West Africa, much like the rest of the continent. So we see a lot of exciting opportunities with pharmacy chains, as some of the other fund managers have mentioned, health clinics, and certainly schools and institutes of higher education.
Hi, this is Roeland, Yungo Capital. In our case, in principle, we're sector agnostic. For us, the main criteria is there a company that has a financing need between 100 to 500,000? Does it need additional support to take the next step? But as our purpose is, the main impact is about job and income generation. I mean, combining both criteria, you usually, within an East African context, it results in looking at ag-related businesses and light manufacturing businesses. As I said, it's 75% of our pipeline and portfolio. One detail on the agricultural side, we of course have a preference for processing companies rather than making direct investments in primary production. Doesn't say that we would exclude primary production, but we would definitely look at whether there's another revenue generating activity around that could de-risk mainly stepping into a primary production.
Great, thank you both. And when looking at the overall landscape, what kind of U.S. institutional investors are you currently seeing allocating capital to private equity overall in Africa?
I can start off on this one. So this is Brian Mazer from Bnew Ventures. I think for us, it's a lot of our initial capital raising has been really private individuals, and to some extent family offices as well that we've spoken to. I had some experience in the private equity world, the former private equity world, before I started off Bnew Ventures, and obviously have been exposed to the larger pension funds and other investors that look at Africa and look at businesses in Africa. But I really think that when you get to the scale that we deal with, I think all of us on the panel, investments in the range of $1 million or less, really tiny businesses where there is a lot of work that has to be done, almost the same amount of work that has to be done for $100 million check size, but for much smaller returns, right? So I think it makes sense for really a smaller subset of US investors that we hope is growing, and that's part of the reason for us being on this panel, but really still too small. And I think it's often people that have an impact dimension to what they're trying to do. So there's actually a pretty interesting overlap between the kinds of investors that we're speaking to now and the ones that I spoke to for my last company, which was a nonprofit. So it gives you a sense of really how far we have to go on telling the story of impact and profit.
Yeah, this is Brendan of Satcha Capital. I might add on to Brian just for kind of a different perspective in that here in South Africa for Secha, so it's about a $5 million fund. And again, to echo some of the things, that's really too small for probably, to be honest, a number of people on this call. So we raised 95% of our capital from South Africans and primarily high net worth individuals or families in South Africa. Now, with the dual mandate of not only to capitalize the fund, but also that provides channel access. A lot of these people want to help the entrepreneurs with whom we work. So it's win-win from them in terms of returns and impact. But echoing the theme of long-term view, the reason why we're on this call is that personally I see Secha and presumably some of these other funds or models as an innovative investment model that is maybe not as scalable, because Rashil and I can't work with many companies despite all the influx of Bain and McKinsey interns, but it's very replicable. So I would love nothing more than for copycats to come and more people to take, do this human capital arbitrage, as we could call it. And, down the line, Secha Fund 2, Fund 3, in my heart of hearts, we'll be funding that Ugandan woman who just graduated from Penn, and instead of going to work for Bain, she works for Secha Fund 2. For 3 years, she works for 3 different companies in Uganda, and then either moves back to Uganda, starts her own company, or joins one of those and has some kind of equity payout opportunity. So really, Secha Fund 1 is a proof of concept for something that should have even greater impact throughout the rest of the continent.
I think actually to jump on what Brendan mentioned and what some of the panelists spoke about earlier is certainly the work to do a $1 billion deal is oftentimes, not many orders of magnitude greater than the work to do, for example, $1 million deal. So there's always a big challenge that smaller funds face in the sense of, funding operations and being able to efficiently work with the same level of rigor as a larger fund can, while ultimately having a smaller set of fees or other sources of income. And this is actually something that we and Brightmore have been innovating a lot on how do we structure operations efficiently and how do we make our operations scalable so that first of all, we as well as other funds on this panel can realize the number of deals that we're targeting to do during the life cycle of our vehicles, as well as also be able to scale our model, as Brendan said, to ultimately become larger and encompass a larger amount of capital and a larger number of companies that we can invest in and transform.
So along those lines, as you were saying, Brendan, many of these funds may be too small for the endowments here today, and I'm sure that you often do hear that. Could you all talk about how you see endowments participating in these kinds of investment opportunities?
Actually, let me go ahead and start. This is Dmitry again with Brightmore Capital. In some cases, as a fund, we may be a little bit on the smaller end, but one of the value that we can offer to even investors who traditionally invest larger chunks of capital is working as a search fund and basically being an entry point into the regions that, whether it's West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, that the panelists on this call are operating in. We all have teams on the ground. We all have deep regional knowledge on the entrepreneurial ecosystems in each of the regions that we operate in. So we offer a lot of values as again, to piggyback on Brendan, as search funds, to basically use our investment vehicles to create a pipeline for larger investors who can then, either invest alongside with the fund or serve as follow-on or exit investors for some of the opportunities that we invest in, and once they grow and demand larger pools of capital.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Dmitry just said, and I'd also maybe ask the people on the call to be open to new innovative ideas. When we had a quick prep call yesterday, and we joked that of course we're all operationally focused. How else could you kind of run something like this in Africa? And yet some of the bigger players that do receive institutional capital, they don't have this kind of post-investment team, this boots on the ground model. And you're seeing that's the reason there's a lot of dry powder on this continent. And our vehicles they will serve as pipelines for the bigger folk. But why not get down and dirty? With us, it's a tougher, grinded out, but it's much more rewarding, at least for me on a personal level, day to day. And I honestly think this is a secular trend for how to do private equity in Africa. It takes the models that you've heard about today. I don't think you can just copy and paste what's worked for the last 50, 60 years in the US and bring it here.
And adding to that, well, I would say, also to Brendan, your previous point, not everything is scalable, but it's replicable. Next to that, I think in a way what we're trying to do is providing the solution the market so far hasn't come up with for the target that we're really for the type of business that we're really targeting. So additional support to prove to the market that this is both on the impact side and on the return side that this is a sustainable solution for a need that's still out there is definitely worthwhile. Because if we can prove this, then definitely, as Brandon said, others might also be interested either to replicate it or to scale it in a faster way.
And I think we have time for one more question here. So thinking about these broader themes and considerations and solutions, could you all elaborate on how you see the Sustainable Development Goals playing into your work?
Okay, well, let me go ahead and start again. We see Sustainable Development Goals as very key to our work in several ways. First of all, as a fund, we are structuring our impact investment mandate to align with these goals. So among the 17 goals, there are some that are not very applicable to us as a fund. Meanwhile, there are others that are extremely well connected with what we do and with the impact that we generate. And then for every single investment that we make, even as it's in the pipeline and we're considering that investment, we're looking at how the impact mission of that investment, how well it aligns to these goals. And likewise, in the way that we're tracking the impact metrics for a fund, we are using IRIS, a combination of IRIS metrics and some of the proprietary metrics, and we map it all back to the goals. So we look at, for example, for every goal, we look at a set of metrics, and then being a fund, we can aggregate and sum up these metrics from our various portfolio companies to see what is our aggregate impact of the fund itself and how does that impact map to every single one of the SDGs that is applicable to us.
I think in our case, I would say, I think there's probably no discussion on, well, and I think for everybody it's a selection, but that is selection applies to what the kind of impact that we're trying to reach. And the goals in itself are not under discussion. To avoid that it's just a story, which is probably in certain situations easy to be done. It's all in the end about a manner of adequate measurement and being able to share those data with our investors.
I think I would add as well that for us at Bnew, I think maybe very similar to both Dmitry and Roeland, we don't in every investment look at the list of 17 SDGs, but I think that we are very explicit in every investment on what we're trying to achieve in terms of impact, right? So whether it's better healthcare for individuals, or it's a better standard of life in terms of income, I think both for customers, but also specifically for employees. I think often employees get overlooked in many SMEs in Africa. I think that it's important to kind of make sure that the value is spread all around. So we do track that quite religiously.
I agree with what everybody's said about the SDGs, and that's absolutely something that Secha and I personally am passionate about. But maybe just to spice things up towards the end of the webinar, I would add that if I had to choose between ticking boxes and SDGs or building the next great African company and having a sort of an apprenticeship model that upskills all the people in the company at the same time, then therefore that not only creates sustainable jobs, but the ability to then go work for a multinational or another company and continue to spread that. I mean, that's our focus. I think it's easy to get this. Just frankly, there can be distractions with filling out metrics and getting asked by DFIs and other people for various track. There's an ecosystem and it takes all kinds. But Secha's role is very explicit. We know our domain expertise. That's why we're in the sectors we are. We know how to grow those companies, and we think that the apprenticeship model, sitting side by side with these people, again, maybe it's not for 100 companies at a time. People do that. They exist. I'm very happy they do. But what our role is pick a few companies, every couple of years, work with them to grow them, create jobs that'll last for a lifetime, and then skills that'll last for a lifetime, and will lead on. I really like what Brian said at the top of the call of changing that African narrative, and I think that's the best way to do it, because honestly, we found that missing middle is big, but it's that human, it's that management gap that we're really trying to solve for every single day.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for the great discussion. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I just want to thank our panelists again for participating in a really interesting conversation, and thank all of our participants for joining us this afternoon. Again, if you have any questions about this webinar or other activities happening in the Intentional Endowments Network, the next slide here has our contact information, and please be in touch. And again, this webinar will be up on our website shortly. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a great afternoon.